We've reached the home stretch before the NBA draft, just over a week away, and I still have no idea what the Sacramento Kings are going to do with the 13th pick. Do they trade it? I think they should. Do they make a selection? Do they go fit? Do they go talent? Do they address their wing depth? Do they throw a wrench in things and go get 7'3" Zach Edey? Who knows what the Kings are going to do? And the same thing can be said for pretty much all 29 other teams. This draft is wide open. The speculation and draft boards and mock drafts are crazy and changing every single day, including that of Leif Thulin, who's one of the great draft experts here on the Locked On Podcast Network, one of the hosts of the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast. He joins me here on Locked On Kings today to talk about the Kings' approach with 13, and he has some names for the Kings to keep on their radar to address both talent and fit. It's all right here for you on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all off-season long. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for our first deposit match up to $100. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News, and what I am not is a draft expert. I have guys that I like. I have guys that I've certainly gotten right in the past, like Keegan Murray. Love that draft pick, and it's been a home run for the Sacramento Kings in many ways. I've also, like the Sacramento Kings, been dead wrong about draft selections year after year after year. I am in no means a draft expert. That's why I go out and get guys like Leif to help me, to talk to. And the Locked On Podcast Network is fantastic. The amount of just talent that this podcast network has in general is fantastic. But draft talent, guys with a keen eye for talent and who different player, how they're going to translate and who teams should select. And I mean, this is Disneyland time of year for them. It's also an incredibly busy time of year. So to be able to get Leif here from the Locked On NBA Big Board on to the Locked On Kings podcast a week before the draft starts is pretty special. I think you're really going to like this conversation with Leif. He throws out some different names, some different options, gives a kind of good insight on how he thinks the Kings should approach the draft, and kind of here's what I have to say about how I think the Kings should approach the draft. So it's a good conversation, and if anything, it helps you just get a little bit more ready for the draft coming up here very, very shortly. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Leif Thulin from the Locked On NBA Big Board. The NBA Finals are over. That means the attention turns to next season, and step one is the NBA draft. Hard to believe we're just over a week away from night one of the draft. That's right, we have 2 nights this year, which is going to be interesting. And Leif Thulin is one of the great experts here on the Locked On Podcast Network, one of the hosts of the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast. This is the busiest time of the year for him, and he's nice enough to spend some time with us here on Locked On Kings to discuss this draft in general and what the Sacramento Kings should do around 13. Leif, it's the home stretch, my man. I know this draft maybe isn't as polarizing as last year's with Victor Wembanyama and years past, but it's still an exciting time. Young men's dreams are going to come true. And from everybody I've talked to, maybe this isn't the most exciting draft at the top, but this is going to be one of those drafts that 5 years from now, we look back and go, oh, look at that steal. Oh, look at that guy. He turned into something pretty special. It happens every year, right?
Yeah, I mean, the most often compared draft to this one has been 2013, in which you say, oh, Anthony Bennett went number one. Of course, then this year is doomed to be awful, or destined to be doomed. Victor Wembanyama was last year, but if you were to compare Victor Wembanyama to some of the players, the two that I think he was likened to the most came out of that draft. That was Rudy Gobert and Giannis Antetokounmpo. So you're not necessarily going to strike gold and get those two who are future Hall of Famers, but it's pretty hard to not have all-stars in a draft. Like, it just doesn't happen. I've gone through the annals of history, and all-stars are produced in each draft. So who are they going to be? Not as clear this year, but it makes it almost exciting from my perspective. On Locked On NBA Big Board, we've had a lot of debates, whereas it's kind of been consensus the 2 years I've been doing it of what's going to happen. And so I'm excited. I think it's interesting. And your Kings are an interesting spot, as are my Jazz. I don't really love where my Jazz are, but the Kings are closer than the Jazz are. So it may be a little less riding on this pick, but it's still an interesting spot.
I mean, it's not debatable that the higher you are, the more valuable the pick is, right? If you have a top 4 pick like the Kings had a couple of years ago when they took Keegan Murray, that's significantly more valuable than 13. But maybe in a draft like this, where there are more question marks and less certainties, 13 might not be a horrible spot this year compared to in years past. And going through the history of 13, Leaf, 13's turned out a lot of really talented players going all the way back to Kobe Bryant. You've had Donovan Mitchell. You've had Devin Booker that went 13. Zach LaVine went 13. So it's not like, okay, this is a number where the Kings are going to be lucky to find any kind of talent. My approach to this draft, though, Leaf, from the Kings' perspective is this, like realistic expectations. I'm not looking for a starter here. If they turn into one 3-4 years down the road, fantastic. I know it's a lottery pick, but my perspective is less on, oh, it's a lottery pick, you got to strike gold here, and more on just try and find somebody who's going to actually help impact winning. And that's maybe not the right approach to the draft to have consistently, because I know there's always a debate between drafting for fit versus drafting best player available. But the Kings are in a win now mode right now. I mean, they've even admitted so. They're trying to win right now. To me, the idea of adding a rookie who is a freshman in college or fresh out of their first year in college, who's 19, 20 years old, who can be molded into something great and realize their potential 4 years from now, that doesn't have any value to me and value to the Sacramento Kings at this point. Doesn't mean that they won't end up selecting a freshman if that's the route that they want to go. But I look at 13 and I look at the position they're in and some of the prospects and go, okay, if they don't trade this pick, maybe they go the Tristan da Silva route. Maybe they go the older prospect route, and somebody who can plug into 12 minutes a night and just help this team win right away. I just don't know if those prospects exist.
Yeah, from right off the bat, the first thing I want to address, and we spoke very briefly off air before this, is that you're right. In my opinion, the Kings and most teams from this draft that aren't drafting, the very top, shouldn't be looking for an immediate replacement for a player or an immediate starter and contributor, because even at the top of this draft, there's unknowns about the capacity of doing so for XYZ team. Now, in the case of the Kings, you have your franchise's top pieces in place. You have players that are supplementary pieces, but really good at the role. You mentioned Keegan Murray. Keegan Murray was picked at 4, and he was a great pick. And then you have guys that have not panned out, have been picked high. So that's very possible as well. But the reason I bring all that background up in this is at 13 in a class that's not necessarily well regarded at the top, you could very well get a guy who slips out of the lottery because people are worried about, oh, this guy's not a very safe pick, and they're choosing safely. And maybe you have a potential guy and you can cultivate him. Or the flip side is maybe you get a Tristan da Silva, you mentioned, who's someone who's a 5th-year veteran who played a lot of basketball, plays very heady basketball, or a Devin Carter, someone from Providence who played 4 years of college basketball, is a 20-point per game scorer, but he's not really a scorer by trade, just kind of figured his way into it, and he would be a role-playing defensive guard. And the Kings, I mean, frankly, I know this is not going to be new to your listeners, but defensively, the Kings were not very good. So maybe that's of note. But the reason I go all the way, the broad spectrum there, is what you're picking is a pick that you think will turn into a good player, but not in the immediate short term. It's just you have to have faith that this player will be good. Whether you make it a safer one or boom or bust, that's up to the franchise's front office. But you're not necessarily saying this guy's going to turn us into back into the 3 seed you were 2 years ago. And so I want to preface that for your listeners. I know that's not news to you, but I think too many people have unrealistic expectations because of the success of the 13 pick and because of previous drafts.
And what you just said right there is why I think the writing is on the wall for the Sacramento Kings trying to shop this pick. It's already been reported, and it's pretty common sense. I don't think we need to hear reports of how aggressively the Kings are shopping the pick to know that it makes the most sense for them to try and move the pick. But shopping it and actually dealing it for the right price or getting another team to actually agree to take that pick, 2 completely different things. Like you mentioned, we were talking very briefly before we started recording here. You don't think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of interest. Is it specifically in this pick or in the range, or do you not expect much movement in this draft at all just because of the way the class is?
I think at the very top, there's more possible movement in the sense that, well, there's not a Victor Wembanyama, there's not a Brandon Miller in order to that you would really want, but the teams don't want to give up the pick. So if some team is willing to part with a player, then you can infiltrate the top 10 or top 13 in this case. But I don't know if the teams that are thinking about getting one of these players want to give up an actual established NBA player for what is an unknown, particularly at 13. Now, should a guy like Ron Holland fall? Maybe a Rob Dillingham, probably not of interest for the Kings, but just for the sake of discussion, those type of players that are very highly touted, have a lot of talent, but are somehow slipping according to rumors. Should they fall, maybe they attract a suitor and the Kings can say, well, we're not going to take either of those guys. They don't help us in the immediate short term. And maybe we can get an established basketball player that is of a position of need, and then you can go fit with a player that's actually established as opposed to going an assumptive fit of a 19-year-old, which I think is always silly. People are like, oh, he's a perfect fit. And you're like, you haven't seen him play in the NBA. Like, he's going to be changing positions. And so I think it's possible, but I don't think many teams are going to want to part with actual assets that move them into that territory typically.
Now, I got the Keegan Murray draft pick right, and it's not because I thought he'd turn into as good. Well, I was hoping he'd turn into as good as he has, and he still has a long way to go. It was because I love the idea of the type of player that he was. I like the fact that he was an older prospect at the time, but I also loved the fit. And this is where I would probably be a terrible general manager with my approach to the draft because I lean more towards fit than best talent available all the time. Now, that's gotten the Kings straight burned in the past, like terribly burned with how bad their draft history has been. So I'm completely aware of that. But when I approach the draft, I cannot help but take into account what the team needs. And for this team, it's obvious. It's 3-and-D wings. Now, everybody in the league, Leaf, wants more 3-and-D wings. It's one of the most, outside of maybe a point guard, it's probably the most valuable position in the NBA right now. And the Kings lack significant size and depth at that position. We're talking about guys that are 6'7", 6'8", 6'9", with over 7-foot wingspans who can space the floor on offense to open things up for De'Aaron, but on the defensive end can stay in front of their guy and, for God's sakes, defend the perimeter to where the Kings aren't giving up 40+% from three every night. That is what they are looking for, and they're not just looking for it in the draft. They're looking for it in free agency, in trades, period. That is the number one need outside of re-signing Malik Monk this offseason, in my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are on approaching a draft for need versus best talent available, but now that I've laid out what the Sacramento Kings specifically are looking for, do you think there are options in this draft class that could maybe not directly address that right away, but could give the Kings some depth in that area, and that's a step forward?
Yeah, I tend to lean toward best player available. I think potential and best player available are the best way to go because if they end up hitting, then you can orchestrate the needs elsewhere. With I actually loved Halliburton, so that's one. And I didn't love Keegan Murray at 4, so 1 for 2 for me. But the greater point being, I think in this case, there's going to be a mix. I think you take the best player available. Should Ron Holland be falling? I don't think he's going to be great year one for the Kings, but he could be really good down the road to pair with other players. Could it be Jacoby Walter? This is like another guy that's linked to the Kings. Could it be Devin Carter? These are all mostly 3-and-D wings because I think that's also what is kind of in that area of the draft. Like you're going to see the top wings, the Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, Dalton Connects, I think are all going to come off the board 6 through 10. And now what's left? You're going to find the faller of that. And then you're going to find maybe a guard that you didn't expect to falls into your lap. And maybe you do test the best player available theory, even though guard is a strength for the Kings, or point guard, that is. So to answer your question, it depends how the board falls. But what I think happens is the position that the Kings probably need most, like you said, is somewhat a versatile 3-and-D wing. I think that is a position that it will be there in the draft. So you don't necessarily have to pick position or best player available, barring a ridiculous drop of someone that I didn't foresee coming. The one name that I would monitor that you haven't said so far would be Jalen Tyson from Cal. So not too far a road from Berkeley up to Sacramento, but I think he's a guy who could play more immediately than some of these other guys. And I know I just said you don't necessarily want to pin players into playing sooner rather than later, but it's just a pick that I think could make sense. And I don't think he's on the radar of too many Kings fans from the few interactions I've had.
Quick break here as I tell you about a great sponsor of the Locked On Kings podcast. That is LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality candidates that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing many hats and might not have the time or the resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make that process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. That's why 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Jacoby Walter is someone that I've seen connected to the Kings for a while, and that might have influenced my looking into him a little bit, but also just from paying attention to his game, immediately the thing that draws me away from him, or that I'm a little concerned about, is in terms of 3-and-D wing, he's on the smaller side. He's more of a 2 than he is a 3, and the Kings, in my opinion, need more 3-4 depth. But he has the near 7-foot wingspan. I think he measured out 6'10", 6'11" wingspan. So he has at least a length on the perimeter. The Kings need to do better or have more length period to be able to just close out on 3-point shooters. And then there's the 3-point shooting, to where he was like a 34, 35% 3-point shooter. So nothing that'll blow your socks off, right? Not like a Jared McCain, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but someone who can at least be enough of a threat on the perimeter to where if he's playing, if he gets opportunity, he should not muddy things down for De'Aaron. What do you think about him specific? And again, this is my perspective based off of conversations that I've had and the limited amount of film that I've watched. I'm no expert like yourself. When you look at him, you think about potential fit. The Kings maybe going a little smaller than they need for a player like that. What do you think about that?
So Jacoby Walter and Jared McCain are almost like foils for one another, in my opinion, because Jacoby Walter doesn't really have this wiggle that you'd associate with a 2 guard. And so that would be his negative. But you'd expect a 2 guard who, I think he's a good shooter. Like, I know he shot like 33.5% from 3, but you watch him shoot and he can really shoot it. So I actually think he's going to be a plus NBA shooter. And I think he's probably a slightly plus NBA defender. That bodes well. But the reason I tend to think lower on him than maybe he will end up going is because I expected him to be a ball in hand guy coming in. And maybe that taints my visualization of what he was at Baylor, because I expected him to do more with the ball in his hands, and he didn't impress me that way. So I think his upside is kind of capped at being a 3-and-D. And I know 3-and-D, like you said, is a lucrative position, one that's needed for teams, but I think versatility is something that's becoming more coveted. So if he can put the ball on the floor, he makes himself more valuable than just hitting open threes and behooving or benefiting himself from having Sabonis or Fox or wherever he lands. But in this case, Sabonis and Fox kind of distributing to him. I think he could work for the Kings, though, because he's not a small 2, like you said. In height and stature, he is a 2, but he does have long arms and he does work hard on defense. Now, Jared McCain, the reason I say they're kind of foils for one another is Jared McCain came in and you're like, well, what is this guy going to be? He's got this eccentric personality and you don't really know what you're getting, but he can shoot the ball and he rebounds the ball. He puts himself in the right positions, but he's just small. Like I don't know exactly what he measured at, but I would hazard a guess without choosing about 6'1", maybe 6'1.5". So that's a guy that I don't think worked for the Kings, even though I'm not a fit guy, but maybe in today's era of basketball where 3-point shooting is so important that you can say, well, you know, that we got a big 2 and a small 2. And one of them is just so good at shooting. And the other one, I think, will be a positive. Like, if you were to put it 0 to 100, I think Jacoby Walter and the skill of NBA players by, 4 years into his NBA career, probably a 65th percentile 3-point shooter. McCain could be 85th. Like, he's a great shooter, maybe even higher. But how many shots will he get on the ball? Because you'd think he's a point guard. So how can he play defense if he's a 2 guard? He does rebound well. but he's not really an athlete. He's not an explosive jumper. He's not a great lateral mover. So I think he suffers for that, but boy, can he shoot the ball. So they're kind of the reasons for why I have hesitancy on both of them are the exact opposite.
I feel like a couple of years ago, granted that was the Keegan Murray draft, but a couple of years ago, I think Jared McCain would be very close to the top of the Kings board for that range, just because of what you said alone, like the 3-point shooting. Plus, he's a hometown story, Sacramento kid, so there's always that kind of tie in, and people love those stories and those narratives here in the California capital. But a Jared McCain pick, and it sounds so harsh to say this, Leif, but the Jared McCain pick to me is what I think the Kings should be trying to get away from. Right there. And it's not anything to do with him, but it's more to do with being infatuated by that elite shooting, which absolutely is a premium skill in the NBA today. But the Kings have that in abundance theoretically, right? On this roster, they still have Kevin Huerter. There's question marks about him and his future. I know different types of players. Kevin's bigger, more of a true 2 than McCain's more of a 1. But they have an abundance of point guards, and I just don't see a way of him consistently cracking the rotation, number one. Number two, again, to me, this offseason is all about getting your roster on the same page with your philosophy. You just recommitted to Mike Brown. He's the first Kings coach since Rick Adelman in almost 20 years to get a second contract, right? You've just committed to this and how he wants to play and how he believes you need to play. McCain does not fit that. So I like the hometown boy. I like the story. I like the opportunity for him as a shooter. And I know this has made me some enemies here in Sacramento for people who love the idea of going out and getting him. I just think that's a yesterday's Kings move versus today's or tomorrow's Kings need to be looking away from that, need to be looking away from the infatuation of the great shooting, but the undersized for maybe less of a fantastic shooter, but more of a bigger, physical, established body who can play the hard-nosed defense that Mike Brown and the Kings are looking for. And maybe Jacoby Walter isn't that guy either, but that's what the Kings, in my opinion, should be more focused on.
I'm with you. And I don't know if it's necessarily Jacoby Walter, be it Jalen Tyson, like I said, Tristan Da Silva, whoever it might be. But my musings on the NBA is basically teams want to get bigger just as much as they want to shoot well. If you can get a big player who shoots well, that's the best thing possible. But you're not going to see very many diminutive guards play together. Like my Jazz are a cautionary tale. Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley were an exceptional backcourt, but it doesn't win you NBA playoff series. And in the Kings case, like they had one of the anomalies of this in Davion Mitchell, who was small, but because he was so good defensively, he could get compensate for it. But you know what he lacked? He lacked a shot. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to be no guards that are small that don't shoot well, but there's also going to be very few guards that are small that are off the ball. Like that's my qualm with Reed Shepherd. I don't think he's a point guard, whereas a lot of people are kind of estimating out of thin air that he's going to be a point guard. And it's like, okay, well, if he's 6'1", he's not a point guard. What are you getting? And I know I digress a little bit, but the reason I bring this up for the Kings is you have your point guard, you have your future, your center. I don't know what position you want to qualify Keegan Murray at, but those are your three foundational pieces. So how do you surround them? I think you get a sizable piece, whether it's a 3 and it's redundant, whether it's a 2 and he's big, whether it's a 4 that you think you can play with through the years. Maybe even go with a center that you think can be defensively oriented, like Yves Missi, who has a bunch of potential. But I think you go for big and skilled as opposed to raw and athletic or small and having one skill. Like you're going for size is almost more important than being a complete player at this point, but shooting and size is what's at a premium. But I think size with a slightly less good shooting is going to be more valuable than really good shooting with lesser than size.
Let's talk about Ron Holland for a second. The general consensus is that he will not be there at 13, but maybe he could slide. And I'll get back to that in just a little bit. But somebody who had a bad season on a terrible team, right? Like the G League Ignite were really, really bad. How much do we read into that when we're talking about an individual performer playing on a team that's literally created to help players out of high school get into the NBA draft and get that year of experience against some more professional players? I have no idea still how to really dissect and break down G League Ignite experience versus playing at the University of Kentucky or Kansas or playing overseas. It's a whole different element. But in terms of what the Kings are looking for, a 3-4 physical, 6'7", 6'8" in shoes, like this is what they're looking at. So I'm curious. First part of it is just your opinion overall on Ron Holland and his ability to develop into something at the NBA level. The other element of that is if he's one of those guys that does slide and the Kings find themselves at 13 and Ron Holland is there, this is burn the Kings in the fast, specifically in a Thomas Robinson draft. But do you almost think the mindset should change to he's there, go get him type thing, or we got to take him, we can't turn that down?
I mean, unless you have someone higher on the board, I agree. Like I said, I do believe in and subscribe in best player available. Ron Holland, I've had as high as 3 at some points of this process.
Wow.
I'm a little lower right now, and it's not because of anything he did differently. It's just I've thought about kind of the philosophy of how this draft will go being different. But the things about Ron Holland, like you said, 6'7", he's a live wire athlete, 38.5-inch vertical, really moves his feet well. Shot's not great, but here's the positive. Like, I agree that he probably didn't put forth the best performance in the G League, but he did score 20 points per game as an 18-year-old in playing professional basketball. Like, those are all facts. And, that there's not that many people who can do that. And I'm like, okay, that's great. So if my Jazz are at 10 and they think, you know what, we're going to go with potential, I won't complain about Ron Holland. So if the Kings are there at 13, Ron Holland's there. And like I told you earlier, I don't think he'd be an immediate contributor because I think there's a rawness, a physicality that he's got to his game that's physical and aggressive. He attacks closeouts. He creates space, but he doesn't shoot well. Well, the Kings need some shooting, right? So that doesn't quite work. But I do think there's a way in which they could mold him into a player that would thrive under Mike Brown, who wants to be good defensively. Like, Mike Brown's adapted to create an offensive juggernaut, but he's defensively an excellent coach throughout his tenure with the Cavs, with the Warriors, all these different teams. And so I think he wants one of those type of live wire athletes. And the best he's really gotten, other than De'Aaron Fox, which is a totally different story, but at the wing position is probably Keon Ellis. And Keon Ellis is a good player, but he's not of the pedigree of Ron Holland in terms of athleticism, nor just out of high school pedigree. So I would probably take that pick. Like I said, I like Jalen Tyson a lot for the Kings. Just 6'7", plays basketball the right way, plays offense, plays defense, shot 39% while on the ball. It's kind of the main focal point of an offense. A few years prior, he shot 41% as just an energy athlete at a different school, meaning he can play multiple roles. And a theme with me, if you guys haven't caught on, is I really like versatility. Some of these wings, like the elite wings in the NBA that are not like the upper echelon, not the Paul George, the Kawhi Leonards. You look at Jaden McDaniels, for instance, one of my favorite players. He's really good on one side of the basketball, and the other side he's a dare shooter. You look on the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got Michael Porter Jr., the premier 3-and-D the opposite way, where he's a great shooter, really, really poor on defense. And granted, he's improving on defense, but these are just the upper echelon in each window. Sure. I'm trying to kind of point the 75th percentile in each as opposed to the 100th and 50th. And so what I'm trying to pigeonhole almost is, or you don't want to be pigeonholed to be relegated to the corner on offense, and then you guard the best player on defense. It doesn't work. Like, at a certain point, you get exposed on one side of the basketball. So I'm looking for complete players, and I think Jalen Tyson's one of those complete players. Tristan Da Silva is a similar story. So that if the Kings do take this pick, I think they go with one of those type of players who's maybe more ready to help them sooner, because they are in win now mode. But I don't know if I fully agree with it because, like I said, Ron Holland is a talent. But it just, sometimes you have to play with your timeline. Timeline matters. Whereas if you're in the top 7, that means you're drafting there for a reason. You're not really very good. So you shouldn't pick a fit. You should pick to make your team better in the long run. In the Kings case, I can make an argument for myself. Take an older player that can help you in the 4 years that they're a rookie. They're cheap, and hopefully they outperform their rookie contract.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Look, the NBA season is over. I know it's going to be a long off season now before the start of basketball again in October. And trust me, once it starts, Prize Picks is the place to be. But Prize Picks can help you kill that time. You can play Prize Picks every day with baseball, with WNBA action. As soon as we get football season started, Prize Picks is incredible for the NFL and college football seasons. There's so many unique ways to play, all while making your experience as a fan and a viewer that much better. Prize Picks is available in more than 30 states across the country, including California, Texas, and Georgia, so you can play right now in the California capital. Plus, Prize Picks offers injury insurance so that your lineup stays in play even if one of your players gets hurt in in the first half or in the first quarter, right? That's especially big for basketball and football games. Nobody else does that. They'll just say tough luck and kind of take your money with that. Prize Picks does not penalize you for a player going down with an injury. There are so many different fun ways to play Prize Picks, so I encourage you to go and check it out right now. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy. Leif, whether it's your big board, the mock drafts, it's been chaotic. And I mean that in a good way, because you see players that somebody has going lottery, that somebody has going at the very, very tail end of the first round, and maybe even sneaking into the early second round. I mean, it's just this, there's so many different opinions on this draft class, and so many guys could go in different directions in different areas. I think it makes it entertaining. I think it makes it exciting. I think it makes draft night unpredictable, which to me adds an entertainment value to it. But I also think that puts a team like the Sacramento Kings, who are sitting in 13, in a position to go, we can take a guy, if we have confidence in him at 13, we should take him higher than he's expected to go, because you know what? We want him. He's exactly what we're looking for. And if we get dragged for it because he was in the 20s on the big board range, or even in the like upper 20s to approaching 30 in the big board range, like, you know what, we'll take him because that's the guy we're looking for, and that's the guy that we want. And some names that have already been floated that immediately come to mind, like Zach Edey, of course, is one of them. And I know there are obvious concerns with being a 7'3" guy and the speed of the NBA and his game being able to translate. Another guy that I see going pretty late, and I know he was dealing with some, I think it was nagging knee injuries at Kansas, but Kevin McCullough Jr. is another guy that I see typically going in like the 20s and below range, that in theory could be someone that the Kings could be looking at, as he might present some of the things that they're looking for on the defensive end and with his size and his ability. So I'm just curious your opinion on those names that I threw out there, and also the thought of being at 13 and being in a position to go, you know what, we like this guy. We don't care where people are expecting him to go. We're just taking him and dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, for that last point, I think I commend the front offenses that do that. Like that take their guy. For instance, a success story of this would be Cam Johnson, picked 11th, was probably 25th at the highest of anyone's big board. 5th-year senior, 3 years at Pittsburgh, 2 years at North Carolina, all ACC, and they're like 11. And his own teammate Kobe White does the wow, like,
yeah.
And so that's how shocked he was. So that's a success story. There are ones that have been like, what on earth are they doing?
Kings did that.
Yeah.
Yorgos Papagiannis.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. At 13th pick, ironically enough, I think. But okay, to answer your individuals, I would steer clear of McCullough.
Okay.
I personally, it's funny if you look at Terrence Shannon Jr., who was at Texas Tech with Kevin McCullough before they each transferred their separate ways. I always was saying that McCullough was the better player. McCullough's the better player. And I thought his basketball was helping them win, and Shannon's was show off, flashy basketball. Well, they transferred their separate ways, and then McCullough got this first round buzz by trying to score, and he was 20 points per game. So what he really is to me like he's a Torrey Craig. That scored 20 at Kansas because he's older and stronger than people. But his knees have gone. He's not the same player. He's a bad shooter. And if he lacks some athleticism, then I don't know what you're picking. So I would steer clear of Kevin McCullough. Zach Edey, interesting. I mean, I think he's going to go in the top 15 to 20. I wouldn't take him for the Kings because you're going to play so many minutes already with Domantas Sabonis that I don't know if you want to have I mean, either you commit to it, you're like, okay, we're going Twin Towers here. Like you got two huge guys and you clog up the paint. But today's day, they're shooting so many threes, even if you're dominant defensively, like which is best case scenario. I don't know how you score with the analytics. Like even and Mike Brown's a cutting edge coach in that department, but that would concern me. So I don't love either of those, but I do think what you're saying, there's significant merit too of taking a guy that's lower on boards. I'm just going to scan through a board, make sure I'm not missing anyone that could fit this. Like I said, I think there's a world in which a guy like Yves Missi, who's on most boards picked somewhere between 15 to 25, I could see him being a center, but just kind of the athletic change of pace guy. Is it a guy like? I mean, maybe you could consider going for. I mean, Tristan da Silva is fairly low on some boards. Johnny Furphy's another guy who I think is athletic and he's young. I don't know if he'd be ready to help the Kings right away, but he's 6'9", he moves like he's 6'5". I saw him twice in person, and he shoots the ball well. And he was at Kansas, and I thought he was a better player than McCullough in terms of what the NBA is. McCullough was the better teammate because he's 5 years older. But I don't know. I think if someone were to put their cards on the table and they take the guy they really like, I always respect that. But I think in this case, those two fits would give me pause, especially McCullough because of his history with injuries. And I think he's a honestly bad shooter. Like there's not much faith I have in his shot, even though the numbers will say it's adequate.
Well, Leif, like we said, we're a week away now from draft night itself. I know it's only going to pick up for you. What are you putting out there? What can people expect from yourself and Locked On NBA Big Board from now until the draft begins?
Well, it's a busy week and a half or however many days now. It's all blending together for me. Raphael is hanging around. Right now it's James Barlow, Richard and I hosting a lot of streams, debating different topics. A couple of them have been who has the most all-star potential. So maybe the Kings could go for one of those guys. Which people are rising. We're very up to the news on who's rising, who's falling, discussing rumors, our personal preferences. So all of the above is there. And then for me personally, I'm doing Locked On Jazz right now, which is making me think in a totally different vein of how to address this draft from how I've been addressing it for the big board before my favorite team. And I think it's honestly more similar to the Kings than you'd think, because I don't think at 10 there's really that star that we can take unless the cards fall perfectly in our favor. But the Kings are in a better spot than the Jazz to give you guys reassurance, because you guys aren't that far from making the playoffs, making a run. But don't fret and say that this is a life or death type of pick, because it's not really. You can be good without nailing this pick, but obviously it helps if you nail the pick.
I'll sneak in a question that I asked David Locke a couple days ago, Leif, because I did a podcast where I was discussing backup plans if Malik Monk does decide to leave in free agency. And first off, to be fully transparent, if Malik Monk leaves, I think the Kings are in a world of hurt, but they got to do something, right? And one of the ideas that came to mind is calling the Utah Jazz and discussing potentially a Jordan Clarkson trade. What is your interest level, or what, just from your Jazz perspective on things, how interested do you think the Jazz would be in moving on from Clarkson? I don't know how heavy the Kings would go in trying to trade for him, how desperate they would be and how much they'd be willing to give up for him, but he's a good motor, a guy that works hard. I think he's a guy that would be very appealing for Mike Brown to have in his rotation.
From the Jazz perspective, I actually would definitely entertain it, because the Jazz, I don't think, have any way of competing beyond what they have these past 2 years. And I've been vocal about, I think it was a mistake that the Jazz did not pick a direction sooner in the year. And I was pro tank for 2 straight years, especially with Wembanyama. But even this year, like, you could say, hey, there's not really stars at the top, but I'd rather, instead of have the 10th pick, because we went 26-26 through 52 games when we started off 7-19, and you make that surge for nothing because you become in no man's land. But long story short, I think the Jazz, if they pick a direction, they say Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, John Collins, even Walker Kessler are on the market. I think that behooves the Jazz, because that means you're picking a direction, and choosing a direction makes the future more clear, even if it is 1 step backwards, 2 steps forward, as opposed to muddling and mediocrity. So I don't know what the Kings would return, but if they're a suitor for Jordan Clarkson, his contract's not horrible. 14 mil average contract. I think it's 3 or 52 is what it was. But the end is backload, something interesting. But anyway, regardless, he gets enough money to command respect in that regard, but he also isn't the worst contract to take on if you're trying to compete. And the Kings maybe have some players or picks that they could send the Jazz's way, and I would be amenable to that trade if I were in charge of the Jazz.
And just because I know that some in my comment section are going to be asking about it, outside of a deal you can't refuse, Lauri Markkanen's not available, right? I've been under the impression that Markkanen's like not going anywhere.
Yeah, it does seem like he is very much entrenched in Utah's future plans.
Good.
My personal preference is the Jazz listen about everyone, because if you have to have a star to win in the NBA, which it seems like you do, I don't know if Lowry's a number one, but he certainly should not be traded for someone that's not, you don't believe is going to be better than him. It's not for an aggregation of pieces. So because no one's really going to make that trade, I think he's firmly entrenched in Utah, and rightfully so.
Well, we'll see what the Kings do on the draft, the trade market, free agency. It all starts now that the NBA Finals is over. Leif, I really appreciate you taking the time, my man, during this busy week to chat with me here on Locked On Kings about the Kings approach. We'll see what the Kings do on draft night, and then I'll have to have you back on, and we'll get your opinions and I guess your grade on how the Kings did and the selection that they made. But good context. I know our listeners appreciate it, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.